Hello there, so in this video we're looking at the principles of transport and exchange. So here's the principles of transport and exchange right at the start. All living cells need constant supplies of oxygen and nutrients. If we have to name some nutrients to are a bit more specific, like glucose, amino acids, things like that. And they need to get rid of the waste materials such as carbon dioxide, and another waste material might be urea. Now, to be able to do that, organisms need an exchange surface. And this is basically just a specialized structure in their body where they can exchange materials with their environment. Now, if we have something like a bacteria, like this, its outer surface, so it will have a cell wall, but just inside that, the cell membrane, it will be its exchange surface. And that's fine for little bacteria, fungi, any unicellular organisms. But by the time we get up to multicellular organisms, and this can be things like mice, frogs, up to humans, and then very large animals like whales. They are far too big, so they need to have specialized exchange surfaces. And as well as that, in some more complex organisms, there has to be a transport system that links the two things together. Links the specialized exchange surface plus the cells in the organism. Now the reason for that is, right, in a unicellular organism, like for example a bacteria, they're very small, so their exchange surface is their membrane. Now that's fine because they can rely on diffusion to get everything they need. Okay, so for them, diffusion is okay. They can get everything they need. But by the time we get to like multicellular organisms, like for example a person, right? Here's their issue. Nice person. So their issue is that they're too big. So diffusion is only effective over a very short distance. So actually they can't rely on diffusion through their outer surface. Because they're just too big. And they've too many cells. So instead what they need to do is they need to develop a specialized exchange surface. In this case the lungs, and more specifically their alveoli. That'll be their specialized exchange surface. And that helps them transfer or exchange materials with the environment. Now in particular, oxygen and carbon dioxide. So they were too big and they had too many cells, so they couldn't rely on diffusion through their surface, so they had to get this specialized exchange surface, and that is highly specialized and allows them to exchange substances with their external environment. Now the next problem is that all of their cells need oxygen. Even the ones in your little toes down here, they need oxygen as well. Now again, they can't rely on diffusion because diffusion's only effective over a very short distance. So now what they need is they need a specialized transport system. So what has to happen is blood has to be sent from the lungs to the heart, and then the heart can pump it around the rest of the body, And that's how we get the nutrients all around. And that's where we need the specialized transport system. And the reason for that is because basically they have cells which are too far away from the specialized exchange system. So the specialized transport system sends it all around their body. So here we are. If you're unicellular, you can use your membrane and you can just transfer everything you need with the external environment through your membrane, and that's fine. But as soon as you get multicellular, you get too big, so diffusion doesn't work very well because diffusion only works well over short distance. As well as that, you're too big and you've got too many cells, so you can't supply them with all those things quickly enough. So if you want to be big, you have to have a specialized exchange surface, and that allows you to exchange substances with your external environment, and it will be highly specialized to be very good at its job. So it will be highly specialized to try and get as much oxygen in as it can and get rid of the carbon dioxide. But then your next problem is that you need a specialized transport system because some of your cells are just too far away from your specialized exchange surface. So if you want to be big, you can't rely on diffusion because you're too big, you've too many cells and they're too far away. So you need a specialized exchange surface and you need a specialized transport system. Now, a good way to show this, and something that you're going to have to talk about at AS, is surface area to volume ratio. So, the type of exchange surface depends on the size and the shape of the organism, which affects the surface area to volume ratio. So, a couple of wee definitions here. Surface area is the total number of cells in direct contact with the surrounding environment. Volume is a three-dimensional space occupied by metabolically active tissues. Metabolically active tissues are ones that are carrying out lots of processes, so they're going to need lots of oxygen from aerobic respiration, and they're going to make ATP. Okay, so if we look at this, around the outside is the surface area, all the cells on the inside are the volume. Now, here's the thing, as the organism gets bigger, its surface area and its volume increase, but its surface area increases less than its volume. Now, to demonstrate this, you'll have looked at cubes. So here we have 8 different cubes. This is their side length in millimeters. From this you can work out their surface area, their volume, and then their surface area to volume ratio. So if this was 1 times 1, then, and remember there's 6 sides in a cube, so it has a surface area of 6. Its volume is 1 times 1 times 1, so volume is 1, so its surface area to volume ratio is just 6 over 1, 6. Now you might see that written as a whole number, or you might see 6 to 1, either's fine. This, 2 times 2 times 6, so 4 times 6, 24, 2 times 2 times 2, 8. 24 divided by 8, 3. So as we can see here, right, even from these ones, in fact, let's just show you the rest of the results. So here is our results. As we can see, as we go down, so as the cube gets bigger, surface area increases, volume increases, but what happens in the last column is the surface area to volume ratio decreases. So if we were to sketch this graph, we would have side length and then plotting surface area to volume ratio. We would basically see a pretty big decline like that. And that would basically just show that as the side length increased, surface area to volume ratio decreased. So as your animal size increases, the surface area increases, volume increases, but the volume increases by more, so our surface area to volume ratio gets smaller as the animal gets bigger. So we go from a shrew here to an elephant. Now, in terms of this, remember, these were our cubes. So if we imagine that these are bacteria, we have very small ones here. These very small ones can rely on diffusion because they have quite a large surface area to volume ratio. But as we go up in size to here, we have a large bacteria, but this has a small surface area to volume ratio. Now, for unicellular organisms, they can only reach a certain size because if they get too big, they can no longer rely on diffusion. So that's why we'll never see a giant bacteria the size of a football or even a tennis ball or even a ping pong ball, because they would just get too big and they couldn't rely on diffusion. So unicellular organisms can never get too big because they couldn't rely on diffusion. If they want to get really big, they have to get a specialized exchange surface, and then they have to get a specialized transport system. So this is if we were imagine these cubes were bacteria. If we are imagining these are animals, it's the same sort of idea. Small animal, like for example a flatworm, might be able to rely on diffusion, but by the time we get up here, even to something the size of a shrew, shrews have lungs, they have circulatory systems, and that's because their cells are too big, or sorry, they have too many cells and their cells are too far away for them to rely on diffusion alone. So that goes back to what we were saying at the start of this video, that if you're an animal and you get too big, you have to have a specialized exchange surface and you need a specialized transport system. And that's pretty much just because if you're too big, you have a very small surface area to volume ratio. Now, what makes this quite tricky is this. As the side length increases, the animal gets bigger, but the surface area to volume ratio gets smaller. So for very small animals, they might be able to use their skin as a gas exchange surface, as they have a large surface area, so it's able to supply enough oxygen for the small number of cells. And it might be able to reach all the cells because of the short diffusion distance. So here, if we have a very small animal, it has a very large surface area to volume ratio. So it might be able to rely on its outer surface as a gas exchange surface because there's only a short diffusion distance. So for example, if this was our small animal, it might be able to rely on diffusion. An example of that would be a flatworm. But imagine then we get to like even about here, might be something like a mouse. A mouse we consider a very small animal still, but by the time we've gone from here to here, it's big enough that it can't rely on diffusion anymore. And if we go to here, like an elephant, elephant's obviously a very large animal, so it has a very small surface area to volume ratio. So this means that it can't rely on diffusion. So it needs specialized exchange system and it needs specialized transport system. Further, which complicates this a little bit, by having a large volume, it also means that they have more cells. So overall, they're more metabolically active. So that means they've got a higher overall demand for oxygen. So that's a bit of a no-brainer really, isn't it? An elephant is much bigger than a mouse. So an elephant is going to have a lot more cells. So it's going to have a higher overall demand for oxygen. Part of an elephant's problem is, though, that the surface area is too small, so they have to have a specialised gas exchange system. Now, even though large animals are more metabolically active overall, so for example, elephant needs more oxygen overall, each individual cell is actually less metabolically active when compared to smaller animal cells. Therefore, each cell in a large animal requires less oxygen per cell than a small animal's cells. Now this is something that isn't on the specification, but CCEA do like to include this in questions. So for example, here we have a couple of different animals, starting with a very small animal, the mouse, going to a very large elephant, and this gives their cell respiration rate, which basically explains how active the cells are. So as we can see here, the mouse, which is very small, has very active cells. A very large elephant actually has less active cells. Now this may have got a bit confusing by this point, so this little summary should help you out. So, large animal, surface area to volume ratio, it's quite small, whereas small animals have a large surface area to volume ratio. Now, because of this, because a large animal has a small surface area to volume ratio, it needs transport and exchange systems. Overall oxygen requirement is very high because they have lots of cells. Small animals have a very low oxygen requirement because they have very few cells. Metabolic rate of individual cells for a large animal might be quite low, but for a small animal might be quite high. And I suppose for this one of the reasons might be, if it's a small animal, it has large surface area to volume ratio, so this would probably lose heat faster, so it would need higher rate of respiration to maintain the body temperature. Now that leads on to the next part, which is looking at features of exchange surfaces. So what you'll see is features of exchange surface are always represented with fixed law. So three features that we're always talking about in this is the exchange surface should have a large surface area. The larger the better. It should be thin. Again, we want a nice thin membrane because diffusion is only useful over short distances. So we need a nice short distance. And there must be a large concentration gradient across the surface. Now if you think back to GCSE, the ways that we looked at the alveoli in particular, we talked about them having a large surface area because there was lots of alveoli and they had a round shape. The exchange surface should be thin. Well, this was useful, or we had this because the alveoli were one cell thick and they were really close to the capillaries, which were only one cell thick as well. So the gases only had to diffuse through two layers of cells. There must be a large concentration gradient. So this is where we talked about good blood supply in the capillaries. And also ventilation, so breathing in and out, maintaining a high concentration of oxygen in the alveoli and a low concentration of carbon dioxide. So Make sure you know this. You do get asked about this sometimes. Now, in terms of surface area, the key points for this are: the larger the area which substance can diffuse, the more substance can diffuse in a given time. So, large surface area gives you a greater rate of diffusion. Next up. Now, by the way, we're talking about the surface area of the exchange system here. Now, next up, we would have talked about how the specialized exchange surface can be designed or adapted to aid diffusion. So, for example, internal exchange surfaces, they've got large surfaces because they're highly folded, or sometimes we'd say that they're invaginated. And then external exchange surfaces might be folded as well. And that's a way of increasing the surface area. Next up, surface area or the exchange surface should be thin. So for example, in the alveoli, we have 1 cell thick for the wall of the alveoli and 1 cell thick for the capillary. So the shorter the distance, the faster the rate of diffusion. And that's why it needs to be thin. Thin gives a short diffusion distance. Finally then, large concentration gradient. Greater the difference in concentration, the greater the rate of diffusion. And I think that's probably a good place to leave that one there. Thank you.